I walked through the hall in a half-dead stupor. My head pounded from the previous night's drinks, and I was hardly in bed for 4 hours. I felt along the wall for the light switch as I made my way down the hallway. The corridor walls were marked with spots where pictures of them used to hang, but I could no longer bear to see their faces. The cold showers were painful, and I used to enjoy the luxury of a steaming bathroom, but those days were gone. Without the icy sting, I couldn't function. Over were the days where I woke feeling well rested and eager to take on the world. Now I moped and forced myself to get up to writhe my way from the grips of endless depression. The internship was the only thing that kept me going. That and Dr. Pearson. He was like a father to me since my parents' accident in that damn blizzard. And I stopped going to class, but I aced my way through physiology and genetics without incident. He vouched for me after, noticing my test scores when the dean pushed for my expulsion following my lack of attendance. He even got me my job in the cadaver lab. I left every morning by 5:30 to arrive by 6. I had a key to let myself into the science building and prep the lab and bodies by 7. Some days I was rushed because the drive-in held me up. The winter seemed to never end, and the harsh maelstroms never stopped. The road that day was particularly dangerous. A fresh powder laid over the icy roads, and the winds howled fiercely, just like the day my parents died. I arrived at 6:30 with my heart racing. I fumbled at the door with my gloves and the small case which housed the fuel warming sticks. My hand shook as I put the case in my pocket with my lighter. Driving always gives me anxiety now. I unlocked the door and made my way down the dimly lit halls. Most people would probably be uneasy in the dark, heading to a handful of dead bodies all alone. I just didn't care anymore, though. But I knew I owed Pearson a lot for what he had done for me. I started my routine like usual. I badged into the lab and made sure to secure the door behind me. It's not a room you can accidentally walk into, and for good reason. I rubbed my hands together with a shiver. They kept the temperatures low to prevent further decomposition and smell. Most people have this idea that it smells like rot in there, but it mostly just smells like chemical. The bodies are drained of fluids as best as possible and loaded with preservatives. To prevent the outer tissues from decay, I spray them with a solution regularly, which basically looks like a weed sprayer. At this point in, the classes dissected the superficial layer of skin, and the inner tissues were exposed. The yellowing muscle fibers were apparent over the more defined bodies, while older, less fit individuals had a tendency to look mushy. The human body wasn't as pretty as the illustrations in the anatomy book. They weren't as uniform looking either. I took a broom next and swept up the bits of tissue which weren't picked up from the class the night before. The loose tissues were properly disposed of in a separate bucket that would not make it into a typical landfill. The bodies would be worked on throughout the semester, and then finally incinerated. A thank you event would be thrown by the university for the families of the deceased. And as repulsive as the job was to the average person, it really wasn't that bad. After the initial shock of seeing the bodies, it was nothing more than accepting mortality like everyone else would have to. Something I already had to do with my parents. The only thing I hated about the job was how curious it made me. I never realized how morbid I was and how fascinated I could be. I longed to do more. On that day, my dream came true. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the door to the lab opened, well ahead of Pearson's usual arrival. It was a rather large man, with a stern, intimidating look on his face. His facial hair was cut with precision, and his eyes pierced through the lenses in his plastic frames. In one hand, he clutched a full-size model of a skeleton, with a heavy support base you'd see in a typical anatomy class. His voice was deep and booming. "Hello, young man. My name is Mordecai Strood. Would you happen to be Jason?" I was taken back for the second time that morning. I hesitantly moved from behind the corpse on the table beside me. Yes, sir. Is there something I can do to help you? Do you have access to this room regularly?" Mordecai chuckled with a smile. I apologize. I forget that I tend to sneak up on people in here. I own a funeral home on the north end of town. I occasionally work in here with Dr. Pearson to help prep the bodies for students. He asked me to take you under my wing. And it was a recent dream, but a dream come true nonetheless. I jumped for joy and jarred my glasses loose. I shrugged to push them up. My gloved hands were covered with cadaver juice. Dr. Pearson had requested his old friend from med school let me intern for him, and I accepted in a heartbeat. Starting that day, I would finish up my classwork, go to my job at the hospital, and spend 2 hours a night with Mr. Strood to see if the path of mortician was right for me. Mordecai left that morning with his model skeleton and class drag that afternoon. The day was filled with tension. Pearson never showed up for whatever reason, and I was constantly bothered to do the maintenance of the bodies that he normally would have done. All I could think of was my internship later that night, and how badly I wanted to leave. I didn't even care that we were facing another blizzard. Not everyone felt the same, though. As I approached the cafeteria, I saw a crowd of people gathered around my friend Christina. She was tall, thin, blonde, and all around gorgeous. She was taking criminal justice courses with her boyfriend, Curtis. The two of them had hit it off quickly when they found out about their common hometowns back in Florida. How they ended up traveling across the country north is a mystery to me. They both hated the snow. Curtis was a car fanatic with a penchant for speed. Driving in the snow isn't a race, though. His vehicle careened through the light at the highway exit up the road, and he was hit by oncoming traffic. I felt so sorry for her. He was in real bad shape, or so I heard. I was extra careful when I left school that day. I finally had something to live for, even if it was focused on death, ironically. I got to work and hoped my shift would be uneventful. I worked patient transport, so my night depended on how sick or injured the populace was. Today was busy. Car accidents left and right, not to mention a nasty flu outbreak. It wouldn't be a relaxing night before I started my internship. Thankfully, Ed worked that night and kept the mood light. He was a few years older than me and always tried to cheer me up since I was typically a real downer. And I knew it was the truth. Ed was what most people called a burnout. I didn't care for the term because he wasn't a lazy guy. In fact, he was one of the most devoted workers in the whole facility. He just never had any ambition to do anything else. He drove the same crummy car since high school, to the same job he's had since he was 18, staying at the same low-rent, one-bedroom apartment, and he took the affection of literally any woman that would give it. Ed was complacent with most things in life, and he never excelled at much, but the guy could tell a story like none other. The topic of today's tale, of course, the Strood funeral home. Naturally, since I was going to work in the creepy, godforsaken basement of a funeral home with dead people, my mentor was labeled a crazy old man who murdered his victims and buried them right on the grounds. I told him to shut up, but he insisted that he wasn't lying. It was a local legend after all. Old man Strood lost his son, and his wife too, driving him insane. I had to hand it to him. He almost made me believe him for a minute. After finally hearing enough tall tales, I split from Ed and went to work in ICU taking patients from their rooms down to radiology, when I saw Christina crying in the hallway. Undoubtedly, Curtis was in intensive care. As much as I wanted to talk to her, I knew that I had to distance myself from the situation. I knew how hard it was to have a loved one sustain an injury in an accident, and I was the last person to give advice on how to cope. As the night came to a close, I sat down in the transport office and relaxed while I stared at the time clock. My eyes were fixated in the deepest stare until I heard the buzzer for the door to the lower level entrance. I stepped out into the hall, and much to my surprise at the door, was Mordecai. He waved me over, and I hurried to open the door. Mordecai shivered as he quickly stepped inside. "Thank you, my friend. I forgot my badge at home. Is your shift almost done? We have work to do." And I was taken back once more by this odd giant of a man. I told him I just needed to punch out and to sit tight. He chuckled. "Take your time. Our client isn't in a rush." By the time I put my coat on, Mordecai already put me to work. He instructed me to go outside to his hearse and wheel the bed up. It was cold, but I came prepared with the fuel sticks I would stuff in my gloves. It only took me a moment to figure out how to unfold the bed and unlock the wheels. The setup was similar to the patient beds I worked with on a daily basis. As the two of us made our way down to the morgue, he urged me forth to badge us in. The hulking man adjusted his black tie as he took a sigh. "Have you heard the news yet, son?" My brow furrowed as I shook my head. Mordecai placed his large hand on my shoulder as he delivered the heart-wrenching news. Mr. Pearson, the man who had been looking out for me like a father, was killed in a gruesome accident earlier that morning while passing the college exit. As I soon pieced together, the same collision which also involved Curtis. Mordecai gave me a moment to process the news as I leaned on the slab which the body bag rested. The large man lowered his head, muttering a prayer before approaching Pearson's corpse. "If you plan to settle down and work as a mortician, it is only a matter of time before you see the body of a friend or a loved one. I didn't plan for this to come tonight, but it may be best for you to let you decide if this is the right path for you. You've seen cadavers, but not a body." The sound of the zipper echoed off the cold metal drawers which housed the bodies of the deceased. I knew that Mordecai was right. To be a mortician, you needed a place to work, and unless you traveled a great distance for work every day, eventually you'd see a familiar face from the community. The day had to come, so why not now? I leaned over the edge of the bed to make eye contact with Mr. Pearson one last time. And it wasn't like the almost inhumane gaze of the dissected cadavers. His mouth was stained with blood, and the bruising around his eyes was immense. The eyes were cold and lifeless, no longer emanating their lively, inviting aura. I nodded my head as I reached over Mordecai's hand to close Mr. Pearson's eyes. He zipped the bag shut with a nod of approval. "I'm proud of you, my boy." The gentle man told me to step outside and get some water, that I was off the hook for loading the body tonight. I used the restroom, wet my face, got a drink, and again contemplated if this was really the right thing for me. After a few moments of soul-searching, I came to my senses and decided it was worth exploring more. By the time I got back, Mordecai was waiting next to the wheeled bed, freshly loaded with a body, but Mr. Pearson's body still lay in the same place. "Are we not taking Mr. Pearson?" I asked him with a shaky voice. Mordecai addressed me with a calm tone. "No, son, we weren't called for him. I just received the news and had to see for myself. We were actually called for this young man." Immediately, my mind conjured images of a grieving Christina. I should have comforted her. I reached for the zipper to see for myself as I had done before, but Mordecai quickly grabbed me by the wrist. He gave me a melancholic stare. "There's not much to see, son." I shuddered at the thought of Curtis being disfigured, but that was the reality of this line of work. I helped Mordecai load the body with an exasperated gasp as the harsh wind stung my face. My cheeks were nearly as red as the bags under my eyes were purple. I made my way to the passenger seat. My legs were noodles, and I plopped hard under the seatbelt. I closed my eyes as I breathed heavily, trying to clutch the hand-warming cases in my gloves even tighter. And I felt something press against my arm as I quickly looked over towards Mordecai. "Drink this and eat. You're malnourished, boy. You have to be strong both mentally and physically for this job." I took the water bottle from his hand and the apple in the bag beside me. I had lost 15 pounds since my parents died. I probably looked just as bad as Pearson did. Mordecai drove cautiously through the inclement weather, but I was still on edge. The road was barely visible as the snow blew into the windshield horizontally, and the drifts of snow whipped across the pavement. As we reached the north side of town, the snow subsided just a bit as the heavy tree cover of the forest loomed over the street. We made our way deeper into the woods and up the hill to Mordecai's home, the place where he lived, worked, and rested. A place where the dead rested too. A long driveway curved up at a steep incline towards the old two-story building. The structure itself was an old chapel. It even still had the cross on top, though it was backed by a strange triangle. I'm not particularly religious, so I didn't know if it bore any real significance. Along either side of the driveway was a small drop, followed by headstones. Apparently, before Mordecai bought the place years ago, it was a regular site of worship and burial for the townspeople in the early 1900s. The long hearse puttered its way up the driveway until eventually we began to slide. Mordecai stopped and stepped out of the vehicle, walking around to my door. He opened it with a mischievous yet unnerving grin. "Well, son, I told you that this job required physical strength and I meant it. The car isn't going to make it up the hill. I'm going to bring you a shovel, then I want you to wheel the body up the rest of the way." I was taken back by the absurd request, which I initially thought was a joke. Sure enough, though, Mordecai made his way back to the house, and back with a shovel and a bucket of salt in hand. Then he made his way inside, and it was dark and I was cold. My face felt like it was being stung by dozens of bees as the freezing wind chill coursed through me. Pearson stuck his neck out for me, and then he was gone. I wouldn't let him down. It took me an hour to clear out the snow and put down enough salt to create a decent enough clearing to wheel Curtis's body up the hill. I wanted to rest, but I knew it was best to keep my momentum, so I went straight to it. With a heave, I lowered the bed onto the snowy drive. The wind blew hard from my left as I slowly began my ascent. My feet slipped as I tried to dig the chunks of salt into the grooves on the bottoms of my shoes for traction. No longer did I feel the cold, as I began to sweat and lean all of my body weight into the bed. Surprisingly, all went without incident until I reached the top of the driveway. In a moment of sheer stupidity, I paused to catch my breath and stepped away from Curtis. I checked my phone in a moment of weakness to scroll through Facebook. I stared in confusion at the most recent status. Christina Janes. He's going to be okay. Then a heavy gust tore through the area, and the bed rolled straight past me, down the small incline, and crashed beside a pair of headstones. I was petrified of what I had done until the moment of the crash. I expected to hear a dull thud, but instead I heard a sharp clank. I approached the body, carefully making my way down, looking behind me quickly to see if Mordecai had witnessed my screw-up. I reached down to the corpse to feel. To my surprise, it was almost plastic feeling. I knew the sight would be gruesome, but I had to see for myself at this point since Christina's post perplexed me. I held my breath, fearing the smell of decay and the sight of gore as I unzipped the bag. The bag didn't house the body of Curtis, though. It was the model skeleton that I had seen Mordecai with hours before. I was completely confused and a bit upset. Had I just done all this work so Mordecai could try to prove a point about my physical well-being? I know he didn't know that I was acquainted with Curtis, but this seems to have drawn the line. I paced in anger, trying to plan my next move. I was exhausted from all the work I had done. Mordecai was right. I hadn't been taking care of myself, and he proved his point. But this was wrong. As I planned what I would say to him, I noticed the pair of gravestones next to the overturned bed. The first read, James Strood, age 4. The second was blank, marked with the strange cross I had seen earlier. Maybe Ed was right. Maybe the guy's son died and he did go off his rocker. But was the unmarked grave next to it his wife? While I pondered this in the snow, the cold got to me, and I quickly got my mind back on the task at hand. I was going inside to demand Mordecai bring me back to my car at the hospital. I was so furious I even left his bed laying in the snow. I opened the heavy double doors to the old church with a gasp. There was a hallway to my left, and immediately on my right, a large open room filled with pews, where I'm sure church services used to be held, but eulogies were given now. I walked into the open room, first calling out to Mordecai to no reply. I glared around the room at the strange crosses carved into the pews, each one backed with the triangle as I had seen outside. I didn't know the difference from a Baptist or a Catholic, but I know in my 22 years of life, I had never seen this symbol even in passing. I walked up to the pedestal at the head of the room, which sat in front of a large curtain. A Bible lay on top of the surface, or at least I thought it was a Bible initially. The cover of the book was again marked with that strange cross, and I flipped through it. The symbols inside looked like nothing I had ever seen. I focused on the markings under the light of my phone, looking for anything at all that resembled a familiar character from any language I could think of to no avail. This was when a shiver ran down my spine. I bet your professors back at school never showed you a book like that, son. Mordecai chuckled at the other end of the room. I could just barely make out the unnerving grin on his face in the darkness. I thought I told you to bring the body up. I don't know if it was the depression or the confusion talking, but I snapped. Fuck you. Is this some kind of sick game? There's not a body out there. What's wrong with you? Mordecai slowly approached. He was no longer grinning. I gave you a golden opportunity, boy. Are you feeling tired now? I had had enough. I took the book off the podium and threw it to the ground, preparing myself to storm past Mordecai. Instead, I strolled past with a lazy, labored gait, until I realized he had grabbed the hood of my jacket. And then the rest goes hazy. My neck wasn't sore, so I didn't think he choked me, and my head didn't have any bumps. I wasn't quite sure what happened, but my cell phone was gone, and I was alone in a dark room. The only light source was a small frosted window on the wall towards the ceiling, so I must have been in a basement. I felt around the wall for a light switch to no avail, but I did find a door handle. I shook the door hard until I began to panic. That's when I heard his voice from the other side. I'm sorry I had to do that to you. The fumes worked fast, but you shouldn't be harmed, my young friend. Please, let me go. I won't tell anyone. Please just let me leave. I pleaded. Never had I desired to live so badly. Mordecai opened the door, and I scurried back along the dusty cement floor until I hit the cold wall behind me. A long time ago, I lost my son, and my wife fell ill as well. I couldn't bear to lose her too, so I started searching every last medical text I could. That is when I happened upon a fellow intellectual, our mutual friend, Mr. Pearson. He promised he could keep my wife alive in exchange for my discretion and service. He needed my help, as I now need yours. What do you want from me? Pearson was a doctor. I'm not qualified. I'm a student. I cried out with a shakiness in my voice. The hulking man closed the door behind him softly and gently approached me with an outstretched hand. I'm not looking for medical expertise. I'm looking for someone like me, a person who understands the hardships and cruelties of a life taken far too soon. Pearson has recognized that same quality in me and showed me that there is a way to defy the laws of nature in this world with the right texts. I didn't know what to do, but resistance was clearly futile against this looming giant. I reached for his hand. Plenty of people know death. Why me? You're smart, Jason. You can stomach it. And most importantly, you're young. Far younger than I was when I started my work here. With luck, you could work for decades into the unknown and revolutionize how this world views life. I am offering you a choice. You may leave. I only ask that you let me show you one last thing before you do. Mordecai begged me as he held open the door, and I followed him out into the hallway. The cement floors were cold, and wooden ceiling beams were exposed and filled with spider webs. The smell of chemicals grew stronger as we delved further into the basement. Mordecai pulled out an archaic key ring, opening the door at the end of the hall. The room was small with the countertop lined with bottles of chemicals, undoubtedly used for the embalming process. A lone light swung overhead in the center of the room. Mordecai locked the door behind me and I began to shake. He moved towards the countertop where another copy of the strange tome I saw upstairs rested. He walked to the back of the room in darkness where I heard the unlocking of another door, followed by a hatch opening on the side of the wall. The madman reached in and pulled a body out of what seemed to be a chute and dropped it on the floor. Mordecai peered down into the book and began chanting something in some archaic language, lost to man years prior. There seemed to be whispers echoing from the walls, and the lights began to flicker. That was when I saw it. From behind the bed came forth the most disturbing creature. An amalgamation of corpses, haphazardly fused, as if sewn together. Their yellowing limbs left a moist trail behind them as it limped along the hard cement floor. The head was almost human in appearance, female in specific. A harrowed look of sorrow was on its face, and it wailed in agony as it approached the corpse. Mordecai stopped chanting and directed his gaze at me. "Don't you see, child? My wife is still with me even after death, but her form is not yet complete. If we work together, we can perfect the process. We can give her the life she was owed. We can revive your parents, and we can defeat death ourselves." And I rushed to the door, crashing into it with my shoulder over and over, shouting as loud as I could for anyone at all to hear me. I looked behind me as I saw the ghastly creature loom over the corpse, feeding with a blood-curdling sound. The sloshing of guts and sinew tearing will never leave my mind. Mordecai chanted throughout the ordeal, and I had no doubt I would not get to leave if I did not agree to help him. While his gaze was beyond obsessively fixated on the thing that was his wife, I rushed towards the counter, grabbing 2 bottles of chemicals. Formaldehyde. Now was my chance. I tossed both of the bottles on the floor near Mordecai and the creature. The liquid spilled all over the floor as I dashed beside Mordecai for the chute which he had no doubt built to drop in food for his wife. I dove inside the small metal corridor, and Mordecai clutched my leg. I kicked frantically while reaching into my pocket for my lighter. I struck the flame and tossed it out of the chute onto the floor. In less than a second, a bright flame roared as Mordecai and the creature let out a screech. The man writhed in agony and finally relinquished the grip of my foot. I scurried up the steep shaft as fast as I could muster. I pulled myself up at the top, finding myself behind the curtain near the podium upstairs. I made my way outside, sprinting as fast as I could. I slipped and slid down the drive as the flames became visible in the windows. I'm not sure what I witnessed that night, or what arcane knowledge Mordecai and Pearson knew of. All I was sure of is that Strood Funeral Home burned down to the ground, and the police reported it as a stove malfunction in the kitchen. Since I knew this was such a blatant lie, I can only assume more people in this town have knowledge of Mordecai's work than I find comforting. I left that day, and I've never gone back.